They say a man's last words define his legacy, etching his final truth into the memory of those left behind. But for Silas, a man the town of Dust Devil Gulch had long considered a ghost smelling of whiskey and regret. His legacy was about to be defined, not by his last words, but by a single, whispered name that would call down a storm. What happens when a promise forged in the crucible of war is called due in a dusty saloon? Where are you watching this story from? Let us know in the comments below. And please consider supporting our channel with a subscription so we can continue to bring you tales from the West. Now, settle in. The sun over Dust Devil Gulch was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked earth and bleaching the life from the wooden facades of the buildings. It was a town that felt forgotten by God, but remembered all too well by the devil. Heat shimmered in waves off the main street, a dusty artery with a saloon at one end and a graveyard at the other, the beginning and the end for most men who lingered here too long. Inside the saloon, the air was thick with the stench of stale beer, sweat, and cheap tobacco. It was here that Flint and his boys had cornered old Silas. Flint, a man whose smile was a crooked slash and whose eyes held the cold glint of a newly minted coin, saw the world as things to be taken. And today, for his amusement, he had decided to take Silas's dignity. Silas was on the floor, the splintered wood digging into his cheek. A river of cheap whiskey trickled from an overturned bottle, pooling near his head like a dark halo. His clothes, already little more than rags, were stained with the dust of the street and the filth of the floor. Laughter echoed around him, sharp and cruel. Flint's men, a pack of hyenas emboldened by their leader, circled him. "Look at him," Flint sneered, nudging Silas with the toe of his worn leather boot. "Nothing but a sack of bones and bad memories. Tell us again, old man. Tell us about the war. Tell us how you were a hero." The laughter swelled. Silas didn't move. His world was a blur of pain and humming silence. He could feel a loose tooth in his mouth, the coppery taste of blood mixing with the sour whiskey. He'd learned long ago that to fight back was to invite more pain. Silence was his only shield. But Flint was not a man to be ignored. He crouched down, his face a mask of predatory glee. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue, or did you drink it away?" He grabbed a handful of Silas's greasy gray hair and yanked his head up. Silas's eyes, rheumy and clouded, met Flint's. For a moment, through the fog of alcohol and despair, a different man looked out, a man with a spine of iron, now rusted but not yet broken. "Leave him be, Flint," the bartender muttered, polishing a glass with a rag that had seen better decades. "He's harmless." Flint shot him a glare that could curdle milk. "You stay out of this, Abe, or you'll be sweeping up more than dust." He turned back to Silas. "I'm getting bored, old man. We're gonna take you outside and see if you can dance. A little target practice." His men whooped in agreement. The idea of using a drunk for sport was the highlight of their miserable afternoon. They hauled Silas to his feet. His legs buckled, and he would have collapsed if two of Flint's men hadn't held him up by the arms, his worn boots dragging uselessly through the sawdust. They threw him out into the blinding street. He landed hard, the impact jarring every bone in his body. The sun was a physical blow. He lay there, a pathetic heap in the dirt. Flint and his gang spilled out of the saloon after him, their dark shapes silhouetted against the doorway. A few townsfolk, drawn by the commotion, watched from the safety of their windows, their faces pale and fearful. No one dared to intervene. In Dust Devil Gulch, Flint's word was law, and his cruelty was the gospel. Flint drew his Colt, the click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the tense silence. "Let's see you run. Old-timer, give us a show." Silas pushed himself up onto his elbows. His body screamed in protest. Every fiber of his being wanted to curl up and let the end come. He had died, a long time ago, on a field soaked in blood and cannon smoke. This was just a formality. But then, something shifted. A memory, distant and powerful, surfaced through the haze. A promise made under a sky choked with gunpowder. A bond forged in shared mortality. He slowly, shakily, got to his knees, his eyes fixed on Flint. The roomy glaze was gone, replaced by a strange, unnerving clarity. "Bun hun nu bun cho," one of Flint's men cackled. "He ain't worth the bullet." Flint aimed his pistol, centering the sight on Silas's chest. The cruel smile was fixed on his face. "Last words, old man?" Silas took a ragged breath. His voice, when it came, was not the slurred mumble of a drunk, but a low, steady rasp that carried an unnatural weight. "Banji," he said, his English clear and cold. "Shoot, but when you hear the thunder of hooves, you'll understand why you should tremble." Flint's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The words were not the plea he expected. They were a prophecy. He scoffed, raising the pistol higher. Big words for a dead man. Silas held his gaze, a flicker of a defiant smile touching his own chapped lips. And then he whispered it. A name spoken so softly it was almost lost to the wind. Yet every man in that street heard it as if it had been screamed. Jedediah Kane. The name hung in the oppressive air, heavier than the midday heat. Jedediah Kane. It wasn't a name you heard often, but when you did, it was spoken in hushed tones in the back rooms of saloons or around lonely campfires by men who knew better. It was a name synonymous with ghost stories and grim realities, a name that tasted of gunpowder and dust. For a long moment, the only sound was the dry whisper of the wind kicking up dust devils in the street. The cackling laughter of Flint's men died in their throats, replaced by a sudden, choking silence. Flint stood frozen, his pistol still aimed at Silas's chest. The name had struck him like a physical blow. He tried to maintain his sneer, to project the aura of control that was the foundation of his power. But a crack had appeared in his facade. He saw it reflected in the faces of his own men. The bravado had evaporated from their eyes, replaced by a dawning, flickering unease. Their smirks tightened into nervous lines. One of them, a burly man named Gus with a thick neck and small, porcine eyes, unconsciously loosened the pistol in his own holster, a gesture of instinctual fear. "What did you say?" Flint asked. His voice a low growl, but the bravado was forced. He was no longer playing a game. He was seeking confirmation of a nightmare. Silas remained on his knees, his gaze unwavering. He didn't repeat the name. He didn't have to. It was already out, a seed of dread planted in the minds of every man present. He had delivered his message, and now he simply waited. "It's just a name," Flint spat, trying to convince himself as much as his men. "He's bluffin', a desperate old drunk tellin' stories." But the poison was already spreading. Another of his men, a younger, lankier outlaw named Billy, swallowed hard. "Flint, I heard stories about Kane, down in the territories. They say he faced down the whole Miller gang by himself. Said he didn't even raise his voice." They're just stories. You idiot," Flint snapped, but his eyes darted nervously towards the edge of town, towards the vast, empty expanse of the desert. The horizon, which moments before had seemed like a symbol of his unchallenged domain, now felt like a stage, waiting for an actor to make his entrance. Gus chimed in, his voice a low rumble. "They say he don't ride for money. He rides for a reason, or a promise." Gus looked down at Silas, then back at Flint, a new calculation in his eyes. The dynamic had shifted. Silas was no longer a helpless victim. He was a potential harbinger of doom. and Flint was no longer a predator toying with his prey. He was a man who might have just kicked a hornet's nest the size of Texas. The tension in the street was palpable. The few townsfolk who had been watching from their windows seemed to press closer. Their fear now mixed with a morbid curiosity. They, too, knew the name. Jedediah Kane wasn't just a gunslinger. He was a reckoning, a force of nature that, once summoned, could not be stopped. Flint felt his control slipping. His power was built on a carefully crafted illusion of invincibility. He ruled because others feared him more than they feared anything else. But the name Jedediah Kane was a greater fear, a legend that dwarfed Flint's own petty tyranny. He had to crush this. He had to prove the old man was lying. He lowered his pistol and strode over to Silas, grabbing him by the collar of his tattered shirt and hauling him to his feet. Silas gasped, his body limp. "You're lyin'," Flint hissed, his face inches from the old man's. "You don't know Jedediah Kane. You're a nobody, a drunk." Silas's head lolled to the side. A faint, knowing smile played on his lips. "He'll be here by nightfall," he rasped. "He told me he would be. Said he had business to the north and would pass through to share a drink. For old times." The mention of old times was a detail too specific, too mundane to be an outright lie. It grounded the myth in a believable reality. Flint's grip tightened. He could feel the tremor in Silas's frail body, a tremor he had mistaken for weakness and delirium. Now, he wasn't so sure. He shoved Silas back towards his men. "Take him to the old shed behind the saloon," he ordered. "Tie him up. If he's lyin', he'll die slow. If he's tellin' the truth." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The unspoken half was that they needed a hostage, a shield, as his men dragged the unresisting Silas away. Flint stood alone in the middle of the street, the sun beating down on him. The world that had seemed so small and simple just minutes ago now felt vast and filled with unseen threats. The wind picked up, howling softly through the gaps between the buildings. To Flint, it sounded like it was whispering a name. Kane. He looked at his hands. They were steady. He was Flint. He had built his reputation on blood and fear. He wouldn't be undone by a ghost story whispered by a drunk. But as he turned to go back into the saloon, to drown the newfound fear in whiskey, he couldn't shake the image of the horizon and the cold, hard knot of dread that was tightening in his gut. The mockery was gone. The fear was taking root. The shed behind the saloon was a suffocating box of heat and shadows. The air was thick with the smell of stale hay and rat droppings. Light struggled through the cracks in the warped wooden walls, striping the darkness with dusty gold bars. Silas was slumped against the far wall, his wrists bound tightly in front of him with rough hemp rope. The initial defiance had drained from him, leaving behind the familiar, bone-deep weariness. Gus and Billy stood guard, their earlier bravado replaced by a sullen, nervous silence. Flint pushed the door open, letting a rectangle of harsh light fall across Silas's face. He strode in, the clink of his spurs the only sound. He pulled a crate over and sat down in front of Silas, leaning forward, his forearms on his knees. This wasn't about public humiliation anymore. This was about survival. "The time for games is over, old man," Flint said, his voice low and devoid of its usual sneer. "I want the truth. You and Jedediah Kane. How?" Silas lifted his head slowly. His eyes, now clear and focused, held a profound sadness. The whiskey had worn off, leaving him stranded on the desolate shore of his memories. "The truth won't change what's coming," he said, his voice a dry rustle. "Try me." Flint pressed, his patience wearing thin. Silas took a long, shuddering breath and began to speak. He spoke not of a legendary gunslinger, but of a young man named Jedediah, A farm boy from Ohio with quiet eyes and hands that were meant for a plow, not a rifle. He spoke of the war, not the glorious charges and waving flags from the stories, but the mud and the filth, the constant gnawing hunger, and the incessant screams of dying men. They had been in the same company, two boys playing soldier until the reality of it had stripped them of their youth. It was at Chickamauga, Silas whispered, his eyes looking past Flint, into a memory 1,000 miles and a lifetime away. The trees. They said the trees themselves were bleeding. The cannon fire never stopped. It was like the whole world was coming apart. He described a chaotic retreat, a line of blue-uniformed soldiers breaking under a ferocious rebel charge. Men were running, throwing down their rifles, trying to escape the meat grinder. He and Jedediah had been separated from their unit, caught behind enemy lines. Jedediah took a piece of shrapnel to the side. He was down. I saw him fall. Silas's hands, tied as they were, trembled. It was the tremor Flint had mistaken for delirium tremens, but he now saw it was something older, deeper, a phantom echo of old wounds. Everyone was running. The officers were screaming to fall back. But I couldn't leave him. He was Jedediah. Silas told of how he had crawled back under a hail of musket fire, the air alive with the angry buzz of Minier balls. He had reached Jedediah, who was pale and bleeding out into the churned-up mud. He wasn't strong enough to carry him, so he dragged him, inch by agonizing inch, towards the relative safety of a wooded creek bed. As I was pulling him into the gully, I felt a fire in my leg, Silas said, unconsciously looking down at his own withered limb. A sharpshooter in a tree. The ball shattered the bone. I fell right on top of him. We lay there for 2 days, hidden in the mud and reeds, listening to the wounded crying and the patrols walking right past us. Ice. He described sharing the last of the water from his canteen, packing Jedediah's wound with moss to stanch the bleeding, and talking to him to keep him from losing consciousness. They talked about home, about the girls they'd left behind, about the simple dream of seeing a cornfield that wasn't fertilized with blood. On the 3rd day, as Jedediah's fever raged, he made Silas a promise. He grabbed my arm, Silas recalled, his voice cracking. He was weak, but his grip was like iron. He looked me in the eye and said, "Silas, you saved me. You took a bullet meant for me or for the men who got me. I owe you a debt. Not for a day, but for a lifetime." He swore on the blood we'd both spilled on that ground. He said, "If you ever need me, for any reason, you get word to me. You speak my name to the wind, and I will come. I swear it." The shed was silent. Even Gus and Billy were leaning in, captivated. This wasn't a drunk's rambling. It was a testimony, raw and real. Flint stared at Silas, seeing not a pathetic old man, but the ghost of a soldier, a hero who had performed an act of insane bravery and had been paying for it ever since. He saw the bond, forged in the hell of combat, and understood that it was more powerful than any contract signed in ink. It was a pact sealed in blood. We made it back, Silas finished quietly. A Union patrol found us. They saved my leg, but it never healed right. Jedediah. The war changed him. He found he was good at surviving. Too good. When it was over, he couldn't go back to the plow. The world had no place for men like us. He kept wandering. I tried to forget. He looked at his shaking hands. The whiskey helped. For a while. Flint stood up and walked to the door, his mind racing. The story was airtight. It explained everything. Silas's limp, his haunted eyes, and the unshakable conviction with which he spoke the name. He had called the debt due. He had spoken the name to the wind. He stepped outside, blinking in the harsh light. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and blood red. The shadows were growing longer, stretching like grasping fingers across the dusty street. And from the edge of town, from the direction of that blood-red sky, he heard it. At first, he thought it was the wind, or the frantic beating of his own heart. But then he heard it again, clearer this time. A sound, faint, rhythmic, and steady. The sound of a single horse, moving at a deliberate, unhurried pace. The thunder was coming. The sound of the approaching horse was a death knell. It grew steadily, a slow, methodical rhythm that echoed the pounding in Flint's chest. It wasn't the frantic gallop of a posse or the boisterous arrival of a stagecoach. It was the sound of purpose, of something inevitable. Every man in Flint's gang heard it, and the seed of fear that had been planted by Silas's whisper now blossomed into a thorny vine of panic, wrapping itself around their hearts. The atmosphere in Dust Devil Gulch had transformed. The lazy, oppressive heat of the afternoon had given way to the tense, charged air of an evening that promised violence. Doors were bolted, windows were shuttered. The townspeople had vanished, leaving the street an empty stage for the final act. Flint's men, who had lorded over this town with impunity, now looked like cornered rats. They gathered in front of the saloon, their faces pale in the fading light, their eyes constantly darting towards the western road. "It could be anyone," Billy said, his voice thin and reedy, fooling no one, least of all himself. "A prospector, a traveler." "Travelers don't ride like that," Gus growled, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "He's riding straight for us. He ain't stopping." The gang's cohesion was shattering. The loyalty they had to Flint was transactional, based on his ability to provide them with coin and protect them from consequences. Now, he had led them to the precipice of a consequence more final than any jail cell. Whispers broke out among them. Arguments flared and died just as quickly. "We should ride out," one man hissed. "Just leave. Leave the old man and go. It ain't our fight." "And go where?" another countered. "If it's him, and he's come for the old man, you think he'll just let us ride away? He'll hunt us down. That's what the stories say. He finishes what he starts." Flint watched his authority crumble. He barked orders, trying to organize a defense, but his voice was strained, lacking its usual whip-crack command. "Get on the roofs, Billy. You and Gus, stay by the shed. Don't let anything happen to the old-timer. He's the only thing keeping us alive." But his men were hesitant, their movements sluggish. They looked at him, not with respect, but with accusation. He had done this. His casual cruelty, his need to humiliate a helpless man, had summoned a legend. From the horizon, the figure emerged. At first, it was just a dark speck against the crimson canvas of the sunset. But with every steady beat of the horse's hooves, it grew larger, taking the shape of a man. A lone rider. The sight was somehow more terrifying than if a whole posse had appeared. An army was a threat you could understand, a force you could fight. A single rider, coming to face a dozen armed men, was an entirely different proposition. It spoke of a confidence that bordered on the supernatural. The rider never broke his pace. He moved with the serene purpose of a hawk gliding on a thermal, a natural part of the harsh landscape. The setting sun was behind him, casting his form in silhouette, turning him into a featureless specter of vengeance. The long shadow of horse and rider stretched out before him, a dark finger pointing directly at the heart of the town, at the saloon where Flint and his men stood transfixed. Inside the shed, Silas could hear the hoofbeats, too. He sat in the darkness, the rough rope chafing his wrists, but he felt no fear. For the first time in years, the tremor in his hands had stilled. The ghosts of Chickamauga, the constant companions of his waking nightmares, had fallen silent. He had spoken the name, and the wind had answered. His friend was coming. The debt, a weight he hadn't even realized he was still carrying, was about to be honored. Back on the street, Flint raised a spyglass to his eye, his hand shaking slightly. The rider was close enough now. He could make out details: a long duster coat, the color of the trail, a low-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. The horse was a powerful beast, dark and tireless, but it was the way the man sat in the saddle that chilled Flint to the bone. He wasn't a cowboy or an outlaw. He was a soldier. He rode with a ramrod-straight posture, a stillness that conserved every ounce of energy, his body and the horse moving as one. He held the reins lightly in one hand. The other rested on his thigh, inches from a well-worn pistol grip. Flint lowered the spyglass, his face ashen. He had seen enough. The stories, the whispers, the old drunk's prophecy. It was all true. It wasn't a ghost story. It was a man. And he was here. "Get ready," Flint choked out, drawing his own pistol. The click of a dozen hammers being cocked echoed in the street. The sound was meant to be a threat, a promise of overwhelming firepower. But in the face of that silent, approaching rider, it sounded pathetic. It sounded like the frightened rattling of a snake just before it's crushed under a boot. The rider was at the edge of town now. The hoofbeats slowed from a canter to a deliberate, almost processional walk. The storm had reached the shore. Jedediah Kane entered Dust Devil Gulch, not with the fury of a tornado, but with the chilling stillness of the air just before it hits. The rhythmic clip-clop of his horse's hooves on the hard-packed earth was the only sound in the unnervingly silent town. He didn't look at the men on the rooftops or the nervous figures ducking behind water troughs. His focus was singular, his gaze sweeping once down the length of the main street, taking in everything, assessing every shadow. He was not what Flint's men had expected. The legends had painted a picture of a giant, a demon with fire in his eyes. The man who dismounted in front of the saloon was of average height, lean and wiry. His face, finally visible as he pushed back the brim of his hat, was a roadmap of hard miles and harsh sun. It was a quiet face, etched with lines of weariness, not cruelty. But it was his eyes that commanded the attention of every man watching. They were a pale, washed-out blue, the color of a winter sky, and they held a profound, unnerving calm. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the worst of the world and was no longer capable of being surprised or intimidated. He moved with an economy of motion that was mesmerizing. Every step was deliberate. Every gesture had a purpose. He looped his horse's reins around the hitching post, his movements fluid and unhurried. He didn't scan the rooftops for snipers. He seemed to know instinctively where every man was. He was a predator in his natural environment, and Flint's gang were merely clumsy intruders. His gaze fell upon Flint, who stood in the center of the street, flanked by a few of his more loyal or more foolish men. Jedediah's expression didn't change. There was no anger, no hatred. There was only a quiet, final judgment. But he didn't address Flint. Not yet. Instead, his eyes moved past the outlaws, settling on the dilapidated shed behind the saloon. It was as if he could see right through the wooden walls. He could feel his friend's presence, a flicker of something, a memory, a pain, a deep-seated loyalty crossed his features, so fleeting that if you blinked, you would have missed it. That single, almost imperceptible change was more terrifying to Flint than any open threat. It confirmed the connection. It sealed their fate. "He's in the shed! Kane!" Flint shouted, his voice cracking with the strain of his feigned confidence. "He's alive. You make one move, and he's the first to die." Jedediah finally turned his pale blue eyes back to Flint. He didn't speak. He simply looked at him, And in that look, Flint saw his entire life assessed and found wanting. He saw the contempt of a truly dangerous man for a bully who postured and preened. The silence stretched, thin and taut. Jedediah was controlling the encounter, forcing Flint to babble, to reveal his fear. "We want your horse, your guns, and then you ride out of here." Flint continued, his demand sounding hollow and desperate. "We let the old man go, and we all walk away." Jedediah's lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. It was a look of profound pity. "You took the wrong man," he said. His voice was like his presence, quiet, calm, and carrying the weight of a tombstone. It wasn't a boast. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the simple certainty of a preacher reading scripture. He took a slow step forward. "Stay back," Billy yelled from his position near the shed, his pistol aimed with a trembling hand. He said, "Stay back." Jedediah's gaze shifted to Billy. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't stop moving. He simply looked at the young outlaw. "Son," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "that man you're with led you here. This is your last chance to walk away." The offer of mercy, so unexpected, was more destabilizing than any threat. Billy faltered, his eyes darting from the calm figure of Jedediah to the panicked, sweating face of Flint. He saw the difference between a leader and a tyrant. "Don't listen to him, you fool! Shoot him!" Flint screamed, his composure finally shattering. But it was too late. The moment of hesitation was all Jedediah needed. He had gauged his opponents, sown dissent, and chosen his moment. His hand, which had been resting loosely at his side, blurred into motion. It wasn't the flashy, theatrical draw of a dime novel gunslinger. It was a short, sharp, brutally efficient movement. The pistol seemed to simply appear in his hand, an extension of his will. The first shot was not aimed at Flint. It was a deafening crack that seemed to split the sky. It wasn't aimed at Billy. It kicked up a puff of dust a foot to the left of Billy's boot. It wasn't a kill shot. It was a warning. A final, thundering sentence in their brief negotiation. The air crackled with the smell of gunpowder. In the ringing silence that followed the gunshot, every man knew the time for talking was over. The storm had broken. The puff of dust by Billy's boot was a period at the end of Jedediah's offer. The young outlaw froze, his mind unable to process the speed of the draw. He stared at the small crater in the dirt, then back at the unwavering barrel of Jedediah's pistol. The warning shot was a masterclass in intimidation, a demonstration of accuracy so precise it was more terrifying than a wound. It said, "I can put a bullet wherever I choose. Your life is mine to take or spare." Flint, however, saw it as a moment of weakness. "He missed! Get him!" he shrieked, his own fear manifesting as rage. He brought his own pistol up, firing wildly. That was his final mistake. The street erupted in a cacophony of gunfire. But it was not a battle. It was a reckoning. Jedediah Kane moved through the chaos with a terrifying grace, while Flint's men fired frantically, their bullets chewing up the dust and splintering the facades of buildings. Jedediah's movements were economical and precise. He dropped to one knee, the first of Flint's wild shots whistling over his head. His pistol barked once. The man on the saloon roof, who had been lining up a shot, grunted and pitched forward, crashing onto the wooden awning below with a sickening thud. Jedediah didn't even watch him fall. His attention was already elsewhere. Two men charged him from the side, hoping to overwhelm him with sheer numbers. His pistol spoke twice more, in a rhythm so fast the shots almost blended into one. Pop, pop. Each shot found its mark. One man clutched his shoulder, his rifle clattering to the ground. The other fell backward, a neat, dark hole appearing in his chest. This was the brutal arithmetic of Jedediah Kane. There was no wasted motion, No theatrical flair. It was a grim and terrible science he had perfected in the crucible of war and honed on the unforgiving frontier. Each bullet was a solution to a problem. From near the shed, Gus finally overcame his fear and leveled his shotgun. The blast was a deafening roar, a wide spray of buckshot that tore through the air. But Jedediah was no longer where he had been. He had rolled behind a horse trough, the pellets shredding the wood where his head had been moments before. Before Gus could chamber another round, Jedediah's pistol appeared over the edge of the trough. A single crack echoed down the street, and Gus dropped the shotgun, staring in disbelief at his shattered hand. In seconds, Flint's gang was dismantled. Those who weren't shot were scrambling for cover or running for their lives, their loyalty to Flint forgotten in the face of certain death. Billy, near the shed, had thrown his gun down and was holding his hands high in the air, his face a mask of pure terror. He had heeded the warning. Now, only Flint remained. He stood alone in the center of the street, his pistol empty. He fumbled at his belt for more cartridges, his hands slick with sweat. He looked around at the ruin of his gang, his face a mess of disbelief and panic. Jedediah rose from behind the trough, the setting sun glinting off the barrel of his Colt. He walked slowly, deliberately, towards Flint, his boots crunching on the dusty ground. He stopped 10 paces away, the hammer of his pistol still cocked, a final ominous click in the sudden silence. The street was littered with the wounded and the dead. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder. "It was just a drunk," Flint stammered, his mind refusing to accept the reality of his situation. "He was nothing." Jedediah's pale eyes were as cold as a winter grave. "He was a better man than you in his worst moment," he said, his voice low and even. "He was my friend." As, in a final, desperate act of cowardice, Flint lunged for the pistol of one of his fallen men lying nearby. He never made it. Jedediah's pistol fired one last time. The shot was not loud or bombastic. It was a simple, declarative sound. The final word. Flint was thrown backward as if punched by an invisible fist, landing in a heap in the dust he had so arrogantly claimed as his kingdom. The silence that followed was absolute. The gunfight had lasted less than a minute, a brutal dance of ballistics and blood. Jedediah stood over the scene, his pistol still held loosely at his side. He was not a hero celebrating a victory. He was a man who had kept a promise, a surgeon who had just excised a cancer. He took a deep breath, the tension slowly leaving his shoulders. He turned his back on the carnage, his duty to the dead and dying finished. His duty to the living was about to begin. He walked towards the shed. The door of the shed creaked open. Silas looked up from the dirt floor, his eyes adjusting to the figure silhouetted against the blood-orange sky. Jedediah stood there, his pistol now holstered, his hands empty. He didn't say a word. He walked in, knelt, and with a small knife from his belt, he carefully cut the ropes binding Silas's wrists. The hemp fell away, leaving angry red marks on Silas's thin skin. He rubbed his wrists, the feeling slowly returning to his numb hands. For a long moment, the two men just looked at each other in the dim light of the shed. They were no longer the young boys who had hidden in a muddy creek bed. They were old men, scarred by the world in different ways. Jedediah, hardened into a quiet, lethal force. Silas, eroded by regret and whiskey until he was almost gone. "Jedediah," Silas whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Silas," Jedediah replied, his voice gentle. He extended a hand. "It's been a long time. Sergeant." The old rank, the title from a life long past, was a gift. It was an acknowledgement of the man Silas had been, the man hidden beneath the layers of grime and despair. Silas took the offered hand, and Jedediah pulled him to his feet. Silas was unsteady, his legs weak, but Jedediah's grip was firm, supporting him. They walked out of the shed together, into the aftermath. The townsfolk were beginning to emerge from their homes, their faces a mixture of awe, fear, and relief. They saw the bodies, the wounded men groaning in the street, and they saw Jedediah Kane, not as a monster from their stories, but as a quiet man helping his frail friend. Abe, the bartender, came forward with a canteen of water, which he offered to Jedediah. Jedediah took it, but he didn't drink. He passed it to Silas, who drank deeply, the cool water washing away the dust and the lingering taste of cheap whiskey. It was a small gesture, but it was everything. It was respect. It was care. Jedediah looked at Billy, the young outlaw who was now being held at gunpoint by the town's blacksmith. "Let him go," Jedediah said. The blacksmith looked surprised, but he lowered his rifle. "He was given a choice," Jedediah explained, looking at Billy. "He made the right one. Get on your horse and ride. Don't come back." Billy, tears of gratitude streaming down his face, scrambled for his horse and fled as if the devil himself were on his heels. Jedediah's justice was as precise as his aim. It was not blind vengeance. He led Silas to the water trough and helped him wash the grime from his face and hands. The act was almost baptismal. As the layers of dirt were washed away, so too seemed to be some of the deep, settled despair in Silas's eyes. He looked at his reflection in the water, a gaunt, tired old man, but a man nonetheless. Jedediah reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small, heavy leather pouch. He pressed it into Silas's hand. "This should be enough for a new start, somewhere quieter." "I can't take this, Jed," Silas protested weakly. "The debt. It's paid." "The debt was never about money," Jedediah said, his pale eyes meeting his friend's. "It was about showing up. Now. It's about seeing you on your feet again." He placed a firm hand on Silas's shoulder. The tremor he had felt in Silas's body earlier was gone. "The man who pulled me out of that gully is still in there. Silas, don't let the world take the rest of him." With that, he turned and swung himself up into his saddle. He had appeared with the setting sun, a figure of vengeance. Now, with his work done, he was just a man on a long road. He looked down at Silas one last time, a silent nod passing between them that spoke volumes of shared history, of a promise kept across decades of hardship, then, without a backward glance at the town he had just liberated. Jedediah Kane nudged his horse forward and rode east, into the gathering twilight, disappearing as quietly as he had arrived, leaving behind not a legend of a killer, but the truth of a friendship that had proven stronger than war, time, and death itself. The sun rose the next morning on a different Dust Devil Gulch. The quiet that settled over the town was not one of fear, but of peace. The bodies were gone. The living had been tended to, and the street was clean. It was as if a fever had broken in the night. The story of what happened would be told and retold, growing with each telling until it became a permanent part of the town's lore. But for the man at the center of it, the legend was secondary to the reality. Silas stood at the edge of town, clean-shaven for the first time in a decade, wearing a new shirt bought with a coin from the pouch Jedediah had given him. He held the rest of the pouch in his hand. It wasn't a fortune, but it was a future. He watched the eastern horizon where his friend had disappeared. He knew he wouldn't see him again. Their paths had crossed one final, violent time to settle an old score and balance a scale. The townsfolk treated him differently now. They looked at him with a newfound respect, not because of the violence done on his behalf, but because they had been reminded that every soul, no matter how lost, carries a history worth honoring. They saw not Silas the drunk, but Sergeant Silas, the man for whom Jedediah Cain himself would ride through hell. The story wasn't truly about the gunfight, the dead, or even the fearsome reputation of a legendary gunslinger. It was about the enduring power of a single promise. It was about the profound truth that loyalty and honor are not abstract ideals, but tangible forces that can reach across a lifetime to pull a man back from the brink. In a land defined by its harshness and brutality, the quietest virtues, compassion, remembrance, and friendship, could sometimes prove to be the most powerful weapons of all. Silas turned, not towards the saloon, but towards the stagecoach office. He had bought a ticket north. He had a new start to find.